Шановні друзі, на годиннику 15:00.
Dear friends, it is 3 p.m. Ukrainian time. I hope you can hear me well. I see that there is quite a big number participating with us. I'm glad to see you here. So we will begin if you permit. I'm glad to welcome all of you, and I know that many participants are joining from different parts of Ukraine. I wish all of us to have fruitful work. I'm Andriy Figel, the national project coordinator with ILO Ukraine for the Ukraine's obligations on the ratified ILO conventions, and we have with us Ms. Hannah, who will be co-moderating this activity with me. Hanna Zarisemenko is a gender-responsive governance analyst with UN Women. I know that you are quite aware with many issues we are going to speak about, and we also have simultaneous interpretation available today. You will have the tools panel on Zoom, and if you speak Ukrainian, please select Ukrainian as your language or select English if you prefer to speak English. Also, I'd like you to pay attention that our today's activity includes the discussion of a number of issues. We have a list of speakers, and I would kindly request our participants to disconnect their microphones after you have finished your remarks. You will be able to ask your questions, and we will ask the speakers through the chat. Unfortunately, because of the current conditions, we are prioritizing the security rules. Therefore, dear speakers, if you hear the air raid alerts, please do not ignore them. Please proceed to the safe place, to the shelters, and continue from there. And please, dear guests from abroad, if you see the numbers of participants dropping, this means that there are air raid alerts, and therefore people are there. For this purpose, we are doing a video recording of our today's event, so all the participants
І надалі долучатись до напрацювання національної стратегії
and join the work on the national strategy later based on the presentations that we have today. And also, I would like to point out one more important issue. Unfortunately, it may happen that there are some energy disruptions, and for this purpose, we have alternative sources of power available. We have a team of interpreters who are aware of this, so it may happen that some of us will have to switch from their computers to their cell phones, but we will be assisting everyone in such cases. And also, if you have any technical issues, please do contact us. So I hope that everyone understands quite well that this is a new reality we have to live in. Dear friends, we have today with us representatives of different countries. We will have the experience of Canada, United Kingdom, and Switzerland represented here. And before we proceed with the Q&A, I will explain why these questions are so important for us today and why we are discussing them. Before we proceed with that, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Rakesh, the Director of the Canadian government department, and also, I'm giving the floor to Mr. Rakesh. And on my part, I would like to express gratitude to him for participation in our today's event.
Thank you very much, Andre, and good afternoon, everyone. It is indeed a great honor for me to be joining you today for this event. And to follow up on everything that Andre just said, I would like to just begin first by recognizing the hardship that Ukraine is going through due to Russia's illegal, unprovoked, and unjustifiable invasion. Ukrainians have been relentless in their bravery in defense of their homeland, and we would like to convey our respect and admiration to Ukraine for ensuring that issues like equal remuneration remain high on the political agenda through these incredibly difficult times. You are not only defending your country, but also defending the values that we hold dear here in Canada, and indeed in many places around the world. So with this in mind, I would like to first thank Ukraine for reaching out to the EPIC Secretariat to facilitate this peer-to-peer exchange. Many thanks as well to our speakers from Switzerland and the United Kingdom, and of course to Commissioner Jensen, our Federal Pay Equity Commissioner here in Canada, all of whom have agreed to share their various perspectives and ongoing work to advance equal pay in their respective countries. Launched in 2017, the Equal Pay International Coalition, or EPIC, has been engaging all relevant stakeholders. This includes governments, private sector, non-governmental organizations, UN agencies, academia, all to work together to make equal pay for work of equal value a reality. And this indeed is really the main objective of EPIC, to achieve equal pay for work of equal value everywhere and for everyone. EPIC really helps to address the gender pay gap in many ways, including by sharing good practices, highlighting measures that have proven to be successful in some countries, learning from one another, and of course, facilitating access to sound data and exchanges like this between countries that could inform policy development on these critical issues. This peer-to-peer virtual learning event is really a perfect example of that. And I know that for Canada, through our membership in EPIC, we have learned so much from other countries on the approach that they take and on lessons learned from their own experiences. In addition, one of EPIC's key strengths is its multi-stakeholder approach and its tripartite nature. This unique forum brings together representatives from governments, unions, employers, businesses, academia, and NGOs with different areas of expertise to address the issue of equal pay at the global, regional, and national levels. Governments, employers, and workers' organizations are all engaged together in this platform to address gender inequalities. And as we know, Ukraine has successfully managed to secure tripartite membership, and in fact is one of only 2 EPIC countries to do so, along with Canada, in fact. This productive collaboration in the context of EPIC complements well the existing cooperation in the area of labor that Canada and Ukraine have long developed over the years, including in the context of capacity building projects that we work with the ILO, and on the implementation of labor provisions found in the Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement. So today we look forward to hearing from our speakers to gain the insights and experiences that could inform policy development and to walk away with a fresh perspective on improving the national legislative framework, equipping employers' organizations with the tools and sharing of best practices to reduce the gender pay gap at the enterprise level, overcoming the stereotypes and barriers that prevent women from equal access to the workplace, and implementing other effective mechanisms to contribute to reducing the gender pay gap in Ukraine and indeed everywhere around the world. So thank you very much for this invitation again. It's really a pleasure for me to be here and to hear the contributions that we'll be hearing this morning. And I look forward to engaging through this event. Thank you very much again for the invitation. Andre, my apologies for interrupting, Andre. We seem to have lost English interpretation.
Dear colleagues, I will be speaking in the English channel, while Ms. Tatiana Berezhna agreed to integrate the meeting with her speech in English. We are facing some technical problems because unfortunately she is frozen on the screen and probably she has some internet connection. So you really see what are the circumstances right now, in which circumstances we live, we work, and we really struggle to achieve some results while doing our work. I'm terribly sorry for this, but please be patient and we'll wait for Ms. Tatiana to reconnect just in a minute. Thank you. It looks like we're waiting for the interpreters to join. Indeed, they have problems with the electricity. They are facing electricity outage. And while they're joining, Ms. Tatiana is with us. I will pass the floor to her to deliver the speech on behalf of the Ministry of Economy. Ms. Tatiana, you're welcome.
The event on behalf of the Ministry of Economy of Ukraine and the government of Ukraine as a member of EPIC coalition. Ukraine is grateful to the coalition for its support and the opportunity to learn valuable experience in reducing gender pay gap. Today, we are participating in the first meeting within the framework of the coalition, which has a very practical goal: to develop elements for the national strategy for reducing the gender pay gap in Ukraine. The war showed that women defend the country on the equal footing with men. They are on the battlefield, they work, they continue to perform caregiving duties. The issue of equal pay needs to be resolved, and it should not wait until the end of the war. The ILO offered to hold a presentation of international experience by EPIC members so that we could get first-hand examples of ensuring equal pay. We understand that these solutions work in different legal systems with different institutional support and level of industrial relations. But we will carefully study the experience provided by you and make every effort to adopt the proposed solutions, taking into account the legal and institutional principles and the current situation in Ukraine. I would like to thank the Government of Canada for their contribution to the process of reforms in Ukraine. Cooperation within the framework of Canada-Ukraine Free Trade Agreement is taking place at high level. If we talk about the sphere of labor policy, Ministry of Economy constantly receives technical assistance from the project of International Labour Organization, which is implemented with the financial support of the Government of Canada. We cooperate in bringing the legislation into compliance with the provisions of the ratified ILO conventions. We jointly build the industrial capacity of the Ministry of Economy of Ukraine. Our event today takes place in the synergy of UN Women and the International Labour Organization, as well as partners from Canada, Switzerland, and Great Britain. We are really very grateful for your participation and support. Ensuring equal pay for women and men is a challenging process, but we really hope that this meeting will mark the beginning of the future cooperation between Ukraine, EPIC, and its members in the context of developing effective public policy in my country. Thank you so much for your support, and I wish us all to have a very fruitful discussion today.
Дякую, пані Тетяно.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. Friends, just a heads up for everyone that we already have simultaneous interpretation in place. Please check it out. I already want to see some smiles on your faces, and I want to make sure that the interpretation is working. I can see smiles on your faces, which means that everything is working. Thank you very much for that. Tatiana, a big thank you for your speech. You know, it's a delight to see that under your auspices, this strategy is being crafted, and that the colleagues that are working with you from the Ministry of Economic Development are motivated and enthusiastic. This is something that we can tangibly and viscerally feel as part of our cooperation, and it's of the utmost importance for us to develop these public documents. I also want to pass it over to Mr. Rakesh, because to the best of my understanding, Mr. Rakesh could not really hear what I tried to say because there was no simultaneous interpretation. So there's this saying in Ukrainian that you test your friends in troubling times. It's a pleasure that we have so many partners providing unfaltering support for Ukraine, but Mr. Rakesh is a person that supported Ukraine way before the outbreak of the war, and multiple initiatives that are being implemented in Ukraine right now are a fruit of his support, the support provided by the Equal Pay International Coalition, the Canadian government, with the support of and under the auspices of Mr. Rakesh. So thank you very much. And I also have this impression that the speeches by Mr. Rakesh and Ms. Tatiana were complementary. So you are on the same track, you are thinking along the same lines. So I do expect that we will have this amazing synergy and we will have fruitful outcomes of our today's communication. So thank you very much for your input. Thank you very much for your opening statements. And regardless of the air raid alert and regardless of some other challenges, I suggest that we proceed. We have a very busy agenda ahead of us, and we intend to discuss a wide array of topics. These are the issues and topics that were identified earlier by our national partners. A couple of words about how we identify these issues. While preparing the gender equal pay strategy, our national partners had an analysis or a brainstorming session, and they tried to identify some gender pay gap in Ukraine. So what the problems are, because we do have these issues with the gender pay gap. So having conducted this brainstorming session, we summarized some of the most common issues. We broke them down into blocks, and that's how we came up with 4 blocks of issues that we would like to discuss with you today. And we have international experts present here. They are opinion leaders. They are professionals that have enormous experience in their countries, and they will be able to shed light on some nuances where we require their support. So I would like to introduce our speakers today. So we will have Ms. Karen Jensen. She's Equal Pay Commissioner of Canada. I also want to draw your attention to the fact that Ms. Jensen has enormous experience in the area of settling labor disputes between employees and employers. Karen also participated in dispute settlement. She represented the interests of both parties to disputes, especially disputes pertaining to equal pay and fair remuneration for the work done. So we are delighted that Ms. Jensen is present here today, and I'm 100% positive that we will have a fruitful discussion and positive outcomes. We also have Mr. Simon Hilber. He's equal pay specialist within the Federal Office for Gender Equality in Switzerland. You know, in the past, we had a strategic session. We presented some tools for estimating gender pay gap at enterprise level. And we are really honored because Simon is one of the developers of the Logic tool. This is the tool that was developed by the Swiss government. It's a pleasure for us to have Simon here with us. And I'm positive that we will glean some interesting insights from him. We have some other guests from Switzerland. We have Ms. Michaela Luis. She's International Affairs Officer, and she also deals with gender equality within the Federal Office for Gender Equality in Switzerland. Ms. Lewis is also seasoned in working with the workplace harassment, domestic violence. It's relevant for Ukraine because Ukraine recently ratified the Istanbul Convention, and the ILO 190 convention will be shortly ratified by Ukraine. At least we are cherishing these hopes. And we also have Ms. Jessica Mace present here. She's policy official from the UK Civil Service. She specializes in eliminating gender pay gap, and I'm sure that Jessica's experience will be insightful and stimulating, especially in terms of reporting on reducing gender pay gap at company and enterprise level. So I'm sure that we will be exposed to some really instructive experience that will come in handy as part of our work in the future. Without further ado, I suggest that we segue into these blocks of issues. By the way, I have already mentioned that we also have Ms. Hanna Harasimenko present here today, and we will be helping each other with the moderation. We also have Ms. Helena Dredova. She represents the Secretariat of the Equal Pay International Coalition, and also Europe and Central Asia ILO office. And we also have Mikhailo Kurykalov. He's our national expert, and he always participates in all our events. He's the driving force behind all these processes, and he's been assistant in helping us summarize all the ideas, so all the insights, because this is something that we have been putting together in the past several months. So this is the robust team of professionals and experts that we have as part of our event today. And so now I suggest that we transition to the discussion of the 4 blocks of issues that I have just articulated. The first block of issues is related to the legislative framework, policies, and also the role of employers and corporate social responsibility. You know, as it has already been mentioned, when we were in the process of identifying all these issues for discussion, we realized that there are issues that need to be regulated at nationwide level. So basically, we're talking about national legislature and national policies and legislative framework. On the flip side of things, there's an array of issues that need to be regulated at local level, at enterprise level in particular. So it would be interesting for us to hear how it can be done at both levels. We know that Canada has Equal Pay Act, and this act stipulates for introducing equal pay plans at enterprise level. This act also includes some duties and responsibilities with regard to compliance. There are penalties for violations, and there are mechanisms for regulating or settling contentious issues. And it's important to have equal pay committees at companies and enterprises. How does it all translate into practice? And most importantly, what are the benefits, or what is the added value for employers from introducing such equal pay policies within their companies? I want to address this issue, this question, to Ms. Karen Jensen. Could you please share the Canadian experience of introducing such policies at both national level and also at company level? Karen, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andre. And I would like, first of all, just to say that it's an honor to participate in this event. And I echo the comments of my colleague, Mr. Rakesh Patri, in honoring the commitment of the Ukraine in advancing gender equality in the midst of an illegal invasion of its territory. This is truly inspirational for those of us in Canada. So before I answer this question, I think I have to give you a little bit of background about Canada. Canada, as you know, is a federation with shared jurisdiction between the provinces and territories and the federal government. There is pay equity legislation in 6 provinces and the federal jurisdiction. However, it's only in Quebec, in the provinces of Quebec and Ontario and the federal jurisdiction, that this legislation applies to both the private and public sectors. Now, the right to equal pay for work of equal value, which I distinguish from equal pay for equal work, the right to equal pay for work of equal value has been in place for many decades in Canada, both provincially and federally. However, to enforce that right, employees had to actually lodge a complaint. And in 2004, a federal task force in Canada looked at whether this complaints-based system was working in the federal jurisdiction. Now, what the task force found, that it was not. They found that this complaints-based system did not work. And it didn't work for a number of reasons. And chief among those was that it was only those employees who were unionized who could really afford to complain about equal pay for equal value. They were backed by unions who had the resources to be able to address this issue. And in fact, the complaints-based system generated lengthy litigation that was very expensive and very difficult to contend with. So at that point, the federal government followed the lead of the 2 provinces, Quebec and Ontario, and enacted what we call proactive pay equity legislation. And this proactive legislation requires an analysis of the worth of jobs, which is independent of market forces. And it requires a comparison of total compensation provided to female predominant and male predominant jobs of equal value. Now, the value of a job is determined by evaluating the factors of skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions of each female and male predominant job in the workplace. So the 2 jobs, for example, the male predominant and the female predominant job may be very different, but they may contribute equally to the workplace in terms of the use of the worker's skills, the effort, the degree of responsibility held, and the working conditions in which they perform their work. So, for example, a mechanic and a daycare provider can be compared. They're 2 different jobs, but if they contribute equal value in terms of skill, effort, responsibility, and the working conditions in which they do their work, then they should be paid the same. So proactive pay equity legislation that exists now in the federal jurisdiction, which came into force last year, requires employers to proactively assess the values of the value of the predominantly male and female work, and then to compare total compensation, even if the employers believe that they have no issues, even if there's no complaint. So every employer with 10 employees or more in the federal jurisdiction must engage in this proactive analysis of the worth and the compensation of female predominant and male predominant work in their workplace. And this must be done within a very strict time limit of 3 years. And this is something that I believe is quite important to our legislation. I do not, as the Pay Equity Commissioner, have the authority to extend that time limit. And I tell employers this: you have 3 years within which to conduct this pay equity analysis, and there are fairly significant consequences of not doing so. And I think this is where the federal legislation builds on and improves the legislation that exists in the 2 provinces, Quebec and Ontario, that served as useful examples. So incorporated into the federal legislation are some important compliance measures. And I would like to stress that the approach that my office takes and will take in enforcing this legislation begins in a very gradual way. Our first approach is to work collaboratively with employers and with other stakeholders to build their capacity to undertake what can be a very complex exercise. So our office has developed tools and guidance materials. And in fact, we looked carefully at the LOGIB tool, and a tool that was developed in the province of Quebec that makes it a more simple process for employers to input the data, to compare compensation, and then to discover whether they have a pay gap or not. And so we have provided those tools for employers, and we say with them, we want to develop these tools collaboratively with you. We have a tripartite working group that helps us to refine these tools and to ensure that these tools really meet the needs of the employers and the stakeholders to ensure that they can undertake the work that's necessary. So we begin at that level where we're working collaboratively with employers, we're partnering with them to encourage compliance. As we move down the timeline and we see how employers are complying and not complying, there may be a change in the way that we enforce the Act. And the Act actually allows for employees and unions and employers to complain to my office if they believe that the legislation is not being properly adhered to. So at that point, our compliance efforts shift and we become more of an enforcement agency. So there are provisions within the Federal Pay Equity Act that allow me to determine that an employer or a union is in violation of the Act. And the Act allows for what we call administrative monetary penalties, which are essentially fines that can be levied against unions and employers and individuals within those organizations if they violate the Act. And the maximum penalties are actually quite high. They're $30,000 for small enterprises and $50,000 for large employers and unions. And they can be issued on a daily basis in the case of ongoing compliance violations. And they also have a requirement to pay interest on a compounding daily basis. So you can see that these penalties can be quite significant. And as someone who has represented employers in the past in various different ways under different legislation, I will tell you that the prospect of a fine can be quite motivating for employers. So what the Pay Equity Act does is that I think it successfully incorporates both an educative function and quite a stiff, quite a rigorous enforcement component. The other thing that can be done, the other compliance measures that I have at my disposal as the Pay Equity Commissioner, is that I can order that the company undertake an internal audit, which will force them to do the pay equity analysis in the event that they are reluctant to do so. Or I myself and my office can undertake the audit ourselves if we believe that that's appropriate in the circumstances. And finally, there are provisions within the Act, and I would say that those would be a last resort measure that would be used to publish the names of the employers who have found to be in violation of the Act and to publish the reason that they are in violation of the Act. And that too can be quite motivating for employers to understand that this legislation is no longer optional. It's not something that employers can opt into or out of, depending on whether they feel they have the resources and time and energy to undertake the exercise. They must do it. And we find that's quite helpful. Andre, I don't know if you want me to move on to the next few questions. Would that be helpful, or would you like to state the questions?
Дякую, пані Карен. Я пропоную також долучитись.
Karen, thank you very much. I suggest that we also include our colleagues from Switzerland in the discussion of this issue, because I know that they have a lot to say, and then we will continue with the discussion of block 1. Just
That's
one
great.
request. I mean, we are pinched for time, and I guess we will have to delay our meeting a little bit because we will not be able to squeeze everything into the time allocated. I can see that there are a lot of issues that need to be discussed, even more than we forecasted. So we can spend hours and hours discussing each and every one of it. So I suggest that we pass it over to Simon. He will also share their experience, and he will complement on everything pertaining to equal pay in the private sector.
Okay, thank you, Andre, very much. I would also like to join the big thank you we already heard from our Canadian colleagues, that the Ukraine, even in these hard times, under these difficult circumstances, continue their ongoing efforts to work towards equal pay. It is very welcome to see all these efforts. So I wanted also to talk to you about the Swiss experience of with legislative framework. In Switzerland, the principle of equal pay for work of equal value is a constitutional right. Today, I would like to talk about two more recent legislative measures, legislative instruments we have, which are more on a practical level. One of them is the Gender Equality Act, and the other one, the Public Procurement Act, we can use as tools to enforce pay equity in Switzerland. So the Gender Equality Act came into force in 2020, and it states that employers with 100 and more employees need to do an equal pay analysis within their firm. They have 1 year time to do the analysis, then 1 more year time to let an auditor, an external auditor, check the analysis they made, and then at last 1 year more in order to communicate the results of their internal equal pay analysis to their employees and shareholders. So by June 2023, every employer with 100 employees or more should have done such an equal pay analysis. The second law, or the second act we have, is the Public Procurement Act, in which every firm who wants to take part in a public procurement procedure needs to affirm that they are upholding gender equality, pay equality within their institution. Also, the national and regional offices can ask that they show a confirmation of equal pay analysis, at least for employers with 100 or more employees. We also do controls or inspections on a sample of firms every year which take part in public procurement procedures, where we as a national government and also some regional governments check for wage discrimination within the firms that take part in public procurements. There are possibility to enforce in a case that we see that there is a grave violation of pay equality. We can do contractual penalties or exclude bidders from future procurement procedures, or even revoke or terminate the contracts. So as you mentioned before, Andre, we have, in order to do all these wage pay equal pay analysis on firm levels, we developed this logip tool. We have had the first version of it since 2006. And regarding the legislative process, or now firms do not have to use our tool, but it is a free tool, which is to their, which firms can use as often and as much as they want. We have seen in our experience that as long as the tool was an optional or voluntary tool, which firms could use, the use was rather limited. So we have seen a spike in the use of our tool since the Gender Equality Act came into force in 2020. We think that it is often quite hard to start an equal pay analysis, or often firms, when they want to do something, or even to, if they don't know whether or not they do have equal pay within their firm, they are standing in front of a large mountain and they do not really know where to start. And by offering them this free and easy measure to be able to do such an equal pay analysis, and by having clear set rules or goals which they need to attain, it is, in our opinion, a good way to motivate firms to do an equal pay analysis and to start their way in this world towards the goal of equal pay.
Дякую, дякую, пане Саймон.
Thank you very much, Simon.
Пані Карен і пане Саймон, якщо можна,
Karen
просто от
and Simon, if you
все
allow me,
нотатки і
I would like
занотувати
to
певні
summarize your
плани
inputs
уточнення.
because I've made some copious notes, and there are certain things that I would like to specify. So what are the conclusions that I have here? So the legislation clearly stipulates the mechanisms and timeframes for reporting. So in some countries, this is 3 years, for some countries like 1 year, then yes, yet another year, then yet another year. So there's a specific mechanism and a time frame for employers to report and conduct this analysis. And it also depends on the size of the company, like, for example, 10 plus employees or 100 plus employees. So this is something that is enshrined in the legislation. So the size determines whether the company has to report or not on equal pay. And there are different options. So it can be voluntary. And as you, Simon, referenced, the use of this tool was limited, or there can be mandatory reporting, and it's more productive or more effective because then everyone started using this tool, and it was a good starting point for them to continue improving the equal pay situation within their companies. Did I get it right? Simon, Karen, I can see you nodding, so I hope that I got everything right.
You
And
did.
by the way, I can see that there's a question from Natalia Hosteva. By the way, Ms. Hosteva represents the Employers Federation of Ukraine. This is the largest employers organization in Ukraine. She already has a question, so I suggest that we pass it over to her. Greetings, colleagues. I've remembered my participation in the project Equality of Men and Women in the area of labor. I think that that was the project implemented back in 2008, 2009. And we were trained in participatory gender auditing. And we also have a gender report within our federation. But I remember this training, and it was training based on ILO methodology, gender auditing, neutral assessment of the workplace as a tool for evaluating gender equality in terms of pay. I have a question to Simon. Are there any simpler methodological tools, something that would be easier for companies and firms? Because if my memory serves me right, the tool that I'm alluding to is quite complex and convoluted. So it was very difficult for facilitators and companies to utilize it. Because I mean, we would go to companies then and we would try to encourage them to use this methodology to analyze the gender equality and equal pay. I didn't really note down the tool that, can you maybe write it down in the chat? Can you tell us more about this tool? Maybe it will be a little bit easier for our companies. Maybe we can borrow this tool and we can offer it to our companies. Natalia, I suggest that your question about easier tools, Logip tool. Well, maybe we can have a separate meeting on this topic. We also conversed with the representatives of the Federation of Trade Unions of Ukraine, because we have this idea of piloting Logip tool at Ukrainian companies. So maybe we can have a separate conversation on this topic. The Logip information is public. It's a free tool. Anyone can use it, including Ukrainian employers and companies. So once again, I just suggest that we have a separate conversation. But in any other mechanisms and tools apart from gender auditing and neutral assessment of the workplace, like this participatory gender auditing based on the ILO methodology, is there anything that is simpler? Simon, there was a question to you.
Oh, okay. So regarding our tool, we tried to develop, or at least the first part of it, we developed it by using data which the firms did have to give to the government anyways. So we tried to make our tools such that firms would not have to have more extra work when in order to do a equal pay analysis. We now have a second tool which goes more into, which is one part for smaller firms, because the methodology of statistical analysis which we used in the first tool was not appropriate for very small firms, which goes more into the direction of really equal pay for work of equal value, where we are also able to compare more jobs which are further apart from one another, whether or not they are equal in value. For this tool, we do need a little bit more information on the side of the firms. But when we develop our tool, we always try to have a barrier of entry to do an equal wage analysis, which is as low as possible. So we always think about how can we keep the efforts to firms to a minimum.
Дякую, дякую, пане Саймон. І
Thank you,
ще
Simon.
перед тим, як ми перейдемо вже до другого блоку,
Before we transition to block 2, there is a question from Ludmila Salo. She represents the Federation of Trade Unions of Ukraine. And then I suggest that we transition to the second block. I do understand that we did not encompass all the issues within the first block, but I really hope that at the very end of our event, we will be able to revert back to that. Ludmila, over to you. Greetings, colleagues. It's a pleasure to see everyone. And I have a question pertaining to the problem articulated by Ms. Natalia Hosteva. I would like to add something. While discussing the idea of conducting internal audits, well, the employers did not really like the word audit. So instead, we used the term self-examination. So while doing that, we discussed all these tools, the Swiss tool Logip that can be used for small and medium enterprises as well. So we put forward these proposals. But for whatever reason, the government did not really heed our proposals. And there was no acceptance among employers either. So they said a flat no to such audits. I mean, you can call them whatever. You don't really have to call it an audit. You can call it an internal analysis. You can call it a self-examination or self-assessment, because that's what we hear from other countries. I mean, this tool works and it's quite effective. So they just discarded this idea. They didn't really want to be subjected to these assessments or audits. And there was only one option on the table then: compliance check. But we've just heard it from our counterparts from Canada and Switzerland that if we keep it just at the level of compliance, then it will not be effective. It will just not work. So I do not really understand why it didn't work. I mean, 2 years ago, this is exactly what we tried to do. We tried to introduce all these mechanisms and tools, but unfortunately, there was resistance back then. I would like to add a remark to that, but very succinctly, please, because we are running out of time. Well, considering the current state of play for companies, half the companies have their production capacities destroyed. So, I mean, it's not the right time to introduce binding or mandatory procedures. So we need to be very cautious. We need to be very circumspect about it. Gender equality is one of the important elements, but we need to stem from the mission, vision, and values of companies, because we have this global UN treaty. They implement such measures, and also these measures are implemented by those companies that want to access EU markets and they want to promote themselves on the global market. So if we want Ukraine to implement Biarritz partnership measures, we are definitely for it, but we don't really think it's the right time to make it mandatory or binding. We cannot just punish with hefty penalties or fines right away, because I mean, just keep in mind the circumstances that our companies have to operate in. Natalia, Ludmila, I'm really sorry for stepping on your words, but I mean, we need to listen more to our international experts, because we can have as many internal discussions as we want, even at a later time. And so maybe we can have these in-house discussions. Well, I'm really sorry. I was out for about 2 minutes because there was a blackout. I suggested we transition to the second block of issues. And now I want to give it over to Ms. Harasimenko from UN Women. She will be moderating that block. I do understand that some of the issues were not discussed, but we will veer back to them a little bit later when we discuss some of the other issues that were identified. Hanna, over to you. Andrei, thank you very much. Colleagues, I suggest that we proceed with discussing some other issues that are directly related to gender pay gap. Occupational segregation, gender-based occupational segregation that we have on the labor market. National experts have had multiple meetings to discuss the issues pertaining to gender pay gap. In their discussions demonstrated with that we have horizontal occupational segregation. So depending on occupations, depending on different types of economic activity, but we can also have vertical gender-based segregation. So depending on the job title and the rank. Ukrainian stats corroborate these trends. Women are more frequently employed in poorly paid domains and jobs like the public sector, education, healthcare, social welfare. And in these poorly paid industries, gender pay gap is the smallest. But on the flip side of things, if these are better paid jobs, there's a bigger gender pay gap. The biggest differences can be observed in the sectors of finance, telecommunications, entertainment, leisure, tourism, and industry.
So this is the support of positive action to support representation of women in the managerial positions. This is well illustrated by the state service. In general, there are over 75% people in the government service, but the managerial level is only held by 1/3 of women. So the data exists, the problem exists, and indeed this phenomenon is caused in many cases by gender stereotypes that influence the choice of profession. Quite often they impact people at the time when people choose their future profession, but something that we need a lot are the recommendations, best practices, successful examples on how to effectively use different approaches, different tools to somehow mitigate this professional segregation, how to promote women in the workplace, especially in the conditions when gender quotas are not popular as a tool of developing women's opportunities, how to get women involved in the areas which are traditionally considered men's choice, such as STEM, for instance, such as sciences. And this is something in which traditionally we have more women. So I would like Karen Jensen to answer, on behalf of Canada, and also Michaela Lisa on behalf of Switzerland. And we will also be glad to hear from other experts. So let us hear from Karen about Canadian experience.
Thank you so much. As a federal pay equity commissioner, I really am quite focused on the Pay Equity Act, and that is one tool among many to address the gender wage gap, because as you mentioned, there are various components to the gap and various reasons for the gender wage gap, some of it relating to the work that women typically choose to go to balance caregiving responsibilities and paid work. That's not so much my domain. My domain is really to look at that part of the gender wage gap that is attributable to the undervaluation of women's work. But I think I would be remiss not to mention one important piece of legislation that speaks to the work that you are looking at right now in terms of enhancing women's participation at all levels of an enterprise. And that is our Federal Employment Equity Act that applies to employers in the federal jurisdiction, so banks, telecommunications companies, and so on, that have 100 or more employees. And that Employment Equity Act, which is different from the Pay Equity Act, requires employers to examine their not just their compensation structure, but also their whole human resource system, and look at and identify what the barriers might be to the advancement of not just women, but also Indigenous persons, disabled people, and visible minorities within the organization. So they have to do an employment systems review to examine what the barriers are. And then they need to look at the extent to which their workforce reflects the level of representation of those different groups within Canadian society. So the idea is, if you have 7% of Canadian society who's, let's say for sake of the example, who is Indigenous, then that same level of representation should be reflected in your workforce. So it's an alternative to the quota system in that it requires employers to set targets to try to meet those representational goals. But there is no set quota that must be met, and there are no penalties for not meeting that quota. Rather, what you have to demonstrate is best efforts to achieve that level of representation within your company. So that's one measure. that we found that is being used in Canada to encourage not just women, but other groups to progress within the workforce. The other thing that I just wanted to mention quickly in terms of encouraging men to take on some of the more traditionally female roles is that it is certainly arguable that one of the benefits of pay equity legislation is that women, predominantly female jobs, will be better compensated at some point, and compensated in ways that are comparable to the value of male predominant jobs, which may have the effect of encouraging men who would like to undertake work that's considered to be typically female, like caregiving, might encourage them to take that sort of work because now the wages are fair, and there's a living wage there to be had, so that it may have the secondary effect of encouraging a more balanced, desegregated workforce. That's it for my comments.
Дуже дякуємо, пані Карен. Шановна Мікаела.
Thank you so much, Karen. And now let us give the floor to Michaela to express her comments on the subject.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Michaela from the Gender Equality Office of Switzerland. Thank you again for organizing this interesting event and for inviting us. It's really an honor to be here to exchange with all of you experts and really devoted people to gender equality. Well, you mentioned how could we work in order to promote women into male or stereotypical male sectors, or also have more women, for example, in higher and decision-making position, also in a context where gender quotas are unpopular. And that is the context in Switzerland. And Switzerland is renowned for its popular votes and for its direct democracy. And in the year 2000, we had actually a vote on this topic. The idea was to introduce a quota in the public administration on the federal level, and it was not accepted by 82%. So really a vast majority of the population was against that. So how did we work in that context? We have two strategies. One, that we believe that the public sector and the public administration has to set an example. So in our new gender equality strategy towards 2030, we actually have measures that concern us, the public sector, where we want to have a benchmark of 40% of female, well, of each sexes, actually, genders within companies and institutions that are close to the federal administration, the institutions and companies with those we work. The interesting thing in Switzerland also, we have kind of changed our language. We also talked about that before, like which word would we use? We don't really use the word quotas, but talk more about benchmark. So we're focused more on targets and measurable measures, and we have a system which is comply or explain. So we don't have sanctions, but it still works efficiently because the companies that don't come to this minimum benchmark, they have to explain why in a public matter. We also have our second strategy, which is well, legislation. Obviously, it's always good to have that accompanied. And since actually 2021, listed companies need to have a 30% of benchmark for the board of directors, and not only, because also a 20% benchmark in the executive board. So there we have two entities where they have to have this minimum quota. That concerns more or less 250 companies in Switzerland. And we have seen that since then, the number has changed. For example, in executive boards in 2018, there were 7% of women, and now this year we have 17%. So it's slowly going up. These companies have actually until 2030 to comply with this measure. Also, another point, an area where we work a lot to encourage women in general in the labor market is really the conciliation between work life and the balance between work life and private life. That is often a point and something that doesn't well, that actually affects and where women are more discriminated, because they are the one responsible mostly and statistically of the unpaid care work of the children and in the household in general. In our strategy, this balance between work life and private life is one of our major focus points. So that's something we really believe it's important to work on. We also have on the legislative level since 2021, 2 weeks parental leave, paternity leave, which is good, which complements to maternity leave, and also a new federal law that improves the reconciliation between paid work and caregiving work. In Switzerland, now it's possible to take a 14 weeks leave for a parent if their child is seriously ill. So that is something that is good. Or also have a paid leave of 3 days up to 10 days per case to be able to care for a family member or a child. In terms of encouraging women in male or stereotypical male areas, we work a lot also with younger generation. We have an event every year that's called National Future Day, where the idea is that the young people that are in the last year of compulsory school can try and have access to all type of different professions, and the idea is to encourage them also in atypical profession choices. And there we work a lot in, for example, the Swiss Skill Trade Fair, where all the companies and professions are there to show the work. We work a lot to have non-stereotypical images, language, etc., and have more inclusive way in order to inform boys and girls of all their different choices. We also, in our gender equality strategy, we also target specifically measures. We have specific measures on the high university level, but also then in the professional field, where we support programs to encourage women to participate in the STEM fields, which is one of the many fields that are very masculine still today in Switzerland.
Дуже дякую, Микаела.
Thank you so much, Michaela. I see that Jessica is also ready to express herself. Yep, let's give her the floor.
Hi, and I just wanted to echo everyone's comments about what a pleasure it is to be part of the conversation today. I just thought it might be a worthwhile point to share the UK experience, because a lot of our work has all focused around the gender pay gap. More specifically, our equal pay legislation is kind of has been around since the 70s and hasn't necessarily changed, but our recent work is all focused on gender pay gap and looking expressly at those contributing factors. And most of our work in this area has focused on thinking the mantra of a lot of civil servants, which is what gets measured gets managed, and what gets managed gets done. So we've looked at introducing a kind of transparent measurement of gender pay gap. So we're fortunate enough that we have national gender pay gap data, which talks obviously about the national picture, which has been published since 1997. But since 2017, we've also required large employers, so with 250 or more employees, to publish specific gender pay gap data about their own organisations, and that is made public. And it has to be signed off at a director level. And strangely enough, once you get organisations to put information about themselves out there publicly for the media and for their employees to see, they start caring about what that data says a hell of a lot more. So they have really taken up the mantle almost, and we as government have kind of worked to support employers who are then looking at how they reduce those gender pay gaps. So what we have seen is things like, and a lot of these are government supported or government backed. So there's a Women in Finance Charter, there's a Women in Tech Charter as well. So specifically, lots of sectors have looked at where they have got large gaps, and they have sought to bring large employers in those sectors together to look at how they can address those together. Similarly, one thing that we have also got pre-existing is what is now termed the FTSE Women Leaders Review. So our FTSE top 100 companies, they publish data. Obviously, we also a situation where quotas here are unlawful, but they set targets for how many women in those board level, but we've now worked down to data on kind of direct reports into board and looking at the balance there. And we've seen quite a lot of progress just through having that increased level of transparency. So I think that's probably a good point to leave it. But yeah, that's essentially what the UK experience has been, that actually getting that data out there means that we can actually bring companies along with us rather than it necessarily being something that we're doing to them. I think they recognise, we're very fortunate in the UK that companies recognise that actually having that gender balanced workforce is something that is beneficial for them. It's also something that's great for their reputation. So they are willing to kind of put in the work. But I think we also manage to support them from a government perspective by making people more aware that the gender pay gap isn't something that you can fix overnight and that it is going to require that generational change. I think that's something that we often see with the drivers of the gender pay gap, that there are those gender norms, that occupational industrial segregation isn't necessarily going to be fixed if the skills aren't there to begin with. So it's starting younger as well.
Дуже дякую. Ми вже почули.
Thank you so much. So we have heard lots of useful advice, recommendations that will surely be included in our national strategy to mitigate gender gap. So maybe Ukrainian colleagues have any questions to the experts. Now is a good opportunity to ask them to raise your hand or to write your questions in the chat.
Поки що не бачу запитань.
For now, we do not see any questions, and please let us proceed with the next block of discussion. So if we have some time in the end, we will come back. Andrei, the floor is yours. Thank you, Hannah. Now we have the next block, which is about the methodological approaches to the measurement of gender gap. So today I have visited the State Statistics Office website, and since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, we all know that statistical data is not being published. So the gender gap and the latest data on it was including data until the year 2022. So if we analyze statistics we had before that, there were lots of issues and lots of questions as to whether the gender gap in Ukraine is measured properly. So it is usually based on the comparison of average pay of men and women, and there is also the international practice according to which the gender gap is based on the comparison of the median level of pay. And previously at one of the ILO meeting, we also heard that the average pay can also be compared if we do not have the data of the median, but we understand from the statistics standpoint that this approach is not correct. And also in the brainstorming session, which I mentioned in the beginning, the participants have pointed out a number of issues about the gender gap, so about the parameters that need to be taken into account, whether it's monthly, whether it's an hourly rate of pay. So these issues are also to be discussed here, and I given the floor to Ms. Karen Jensen to hear about the Canadian experience of measuring the gender gap and methodological approaches used. So also later, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Simon and Ms. Jessica, because they were also taking part in this work. And actually, Jessica is a specialist on the analysis of gender gap in the UK. So the floor now goes to Karen, and later we will give the floor to other speakers as well.
Thank you, Andre. I think I would like to defer to my colleagues because, as I mentioned, I'm happy to speak about how we calculate total compensation and measure the gap within an enterprise for the purpose of equal pay for equal value. But that's just one slice of the gender pay gap. And so if you want a broader perspective than that, I would defer to people like Jessica to speak with you about that. But I'm happy to come back later.
Yeah, I'm happy to continue. So in terms of estimating the gender pay gap, we've, as I say, our Office for National Statistics publishes data on the national gender pay gap on an annual basis. These are broken down by region, broken down by age, broken down by working patterns. So we have different figures for the overall gap, the part-time gap and the full-time gap. So we're very fortunate in that we have that national level data. One of the things that I would say we found is that actually it's I think all statistics, and I think everyone would agree with me, have to be taken within their context. So for example, we often see negative gender pay gap when it comes to part-time work. But actually, when you look at the overall figure, we still have a significant gender pay gap for all employees, partly just because of the number of part-time employees that we have overall, and the number of women who are in part-time work. So part-time work is still predominantly underpaid in comparison to its full-time counterparts. So I think there's obviously, I think, yes, there are potentially methodological caveats when it comes to calculating gender pay gaps. But I think even more so, there's a real importance in terms of placing the figures that you do calculate within the context in which they belong. One thing I would argue for, and I come at this from not being an analyst, but coming from being a policy official, I would say in terms of the key importance when it comes to the methodology you use is the continuity, because gender pay gap is not something that changes necessarily a huge amount year on year. But as I say, we've had national figures since 1997. And you can see the change over that time, but the only reason we can see the change over that time is because we've kept the methodology the same across that time. So I would say there are going to be drawbacks to whatever methodology you use, but whatever it is that you should potentially stick with it and continue with certain caveats, just so that you can actually see that long-term trend. The other thing I would say is just in terms of looking at when we introduced gender pay gap reporting at company level, one thing to be clear on is what elements of pay are included when you're discussing the gender pay gap and which are not. One thing that we've found is that we have separate employers are required to report separate data on bonuses, and in certain sectors this is hugely important data, where bonuses make up a significant amount of pay. Not so much when you're looking at public sector organisations, but certainly when you're looking in terms of things like finance and law, where bonuses are a huge proportion of someone's eventual take-home salary. It's really important to be able to see that data as well. So I think it's just important to understand what you mean when you say pay, when it comes to actually what the data is telling you. But I'm quite happy to defer to Switzerland on this point as well.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to take over. Starting, I had to laugh a little bit when I heard that there is criticism towards the methodology on how the gender pay gap is measured, because I mean I think it's the same everywhere. So also we do have regular criticism on how the gender pay gap is measured, or what could be included more, how we could shave 1-2% left or right. But in the end, with pretty much every methodology we use, we still find a gender pay gap. I think what Jessica said is very important, that the methodology should be stable over time in order to be able to compare how it changes over time. Now for my answer, I wanted to start to explain how we measure the gender pay gap. So in Switzerland, we try to look at the unexplained gender pay gap. It's basically our most important, or one of our key indicators. And to do so, we compare full-time equivalent wages of men and women, because in the eyes of our policies, the unexplained gender pay gap is really what we call discrimination. There are a lot of other also very interesting factors if you look at the overall wage differences, where you could also take into account promotion discrimination or other effects. But currently in Switzerland, we mostly focus on the unexplained pay gap. We do compute it by using a representative sample of employer wage data, which we have on a basis of every 2 years. In order to control, our control variables are age as a proxy for experience, the years of service within a firm, education status, marital status, residency status, the job title of a person, size of the firm, the economic field or sector of a firm, region, full or part-time work, whether or not someone is working on a monthly or an hourly pay, whether or not there's a collective wage agreement, and whether or not the contract is a fixed or is a fixed term contract or not. So these are the variable we use to then deconstruct the, once again, full-time equivalent wages of men and women. When we do so, we find that there is about an 8% unexplained wage difference between men and women on the national level. We also deconstruct it into regions or by firm size, which is important for different policy aspects. Now, in the question we received beforehand, there is a question whether or not the number of children someone has should be included in such deconstruction of wages or in the reporting of the wage gap. And I think that's, like, for me, it's a very important aspect, that it is very interesting to take into account how many children, or if the number of children does affect wages of women, I think in particular, if research shows us that usually women are affected by that. But it is important to not, or it is left to the policy, to the legislator to decide. But for me, as a methodological point of view, I would not include it as a variable when you deconstruct wages, because then you mask the level of discrimination women have in the labor market if you add the number of children, because these usually affect women disproportionately. And by including a variable such as children in the wage deconstruction, when you look at the unexplained effects, you will automatically have a lower effect. But whether or not it is justified is left to the people who decide which variables should be taken into consideration. So maybe not all variables that explain wage should be considered in a decomposition of wage, because the variable themselves might be discriminatory. Yes, that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much, Simon. A very interesting comment. I suggest that the participants ask their questions, if there are any, while you are pondering over your questions. I would like to veer back to one organizational issues, because there was an air raid alert across the country. Now it's clear in some parts and regions of the country, so most likely people will be able to exit shelters and be back at our meeting. This is the part and parcel of our today's reality, and unfortunately there are also blackouts and power cuts in multiple regions. So if some people are out, I feel really sorry. Simon, just some points of clarification. When you were saying whether the fact of children and the number of children should be taken into account or not. So you think that this factor should not be factored in? It might be considered, but you think that it might be discriminatory. So you believe that it should not be taken into account.
So yeah, I mean, it is certainly interesting if we look at wage differences between men and women, and also if the wage difference changes depending on how many children someone has. In the end, if someone thinks that the wage of a person should depend on how many children they have, then it can be taken into account. But the question is, does the number of children someone has at home affect how well someone is able to do his or her job? Is left to the people in charge to decide.
Thank you for that. I can see that Jessica raised her hand. I guess you have a comment or an addition?
Yeah, I was just going to say that our national statistics don't look just at the unexplained gap. Ours look at the gender pay gap overall. So it doesn't account for if some of that may be down to discrimination, some of it may be down to occupational segregation. We don't control for those factors. But I would say that even in doing that, you can't necessarily tell, obviously, from numbers of children, but you can very easily, if you're tracking the gender pay gap by age, you can see that actually, I mean, certainly within the UK, we can see that the gap is relatively close to zero until you reach about 30, 35, at which point it widens up significantly. And strangely enough, that's the point at which most women end up starting a family. So you can still kind of see the influence of those factors without necessarily controlling for them. Obviously, that's an extrapolation, but I think there's fairly good evidence on the motherhood penalty internationally in order to be able to see that without necessarily having to control for it within the data.
Thank you, Jessica. Dear participants, we are running out of time very quickly, so I suggest that we transition to the last block of issues. And if we have some time left, then we will be able to revert to some of the issues that were not covered in the first part of our meeting. I want to pass it over to Hannah. And so once again, let me reiterate that at the very end of event, we will try to go back to some of the outstanding issues. Thank you very much, Andre. The last block of issues pertains to some of the aspects that we have already referenced, whether a woman has children, the influence of gender stereotypes, unequal distribution of caregiving and household duties between men and women. In Ukraine, we made an attempt to conduct a pilot study on the use of working time. It was not really a full-fledged study. It was just a pilot. And this study demonstrated that women invest at least twofold time into unpaid household work, care work, and some other associated work. We have some experts involved in the development of this strategy, and they formulated one question. What can we do so that this care work, both paid and unpaid, that women are engaged in, will be recognized? What can we do so that this paid and unpaid care work will have the same value as other types of activity? I do understand that it's a very vague question because there are no specific tools, mechanisms here, but we would like to hear your inputs or your insights in this regard. I suggest that all the participating experts contribute, and I suggest that we start with Karen.
Thanks very much. My comments would be very limited in the sense that, again, I am looking at equal pay for work of equal value and the measurement of pay gaps within a firm based on that. But I can say that the undervaluation of caregiving work is often reflected in the undervaluation of work in the workforce that resembles the care work that's done at home. And so one of the things that we tell employers that they need to do is to pay attention to those aspects of women's work or work that is predominantly done by women in the workforce that is undervalued or taken for granted, if you will, and therefore not counted, not given point value in the evaluation of the worth of the job. And so when the legislation stipulates that the evaluation, the job evaluation, must be non-discriminatory, that means that things like caregiving, and I often provide the example of women who are in predominantly female jobs, such as administrative assistants, who are expected to do things like cleaning up after the meeting is over. After a meeting is convened among executives or whomever, the administrative assistant is expected to go in and clean up, as a mother would do at the end of a meal. And yet that's often not taken into account in the evaluation of the worth of that job. That's just simply assumed to be the work that women do, and it's of no consequential value. What we say is that in order to ensure that you are truly doing a non-discriminatory evaluation of the work, you must recognize the work that has typically been done by women in caregiving, cleaning, and other kinds of things that's often disregarded. And just pointing that out to people has quite an eye-opening effect in terms of the way that that kind of work is viewed, not only in the workplace, but also in the home. So that's it for my comments on that. Thank you.
Дякую, пані Карен. На жаль, в Ганни.
Thank you, Karen. It looks like Hannah is having some technical issues. I think she was disconnected. And now I want to give the floor to Michaela. Maybe she has some comments.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, in Switzerland, we do also have the same problem. Statistically, women are the one doing most of the care work in the household or taking care of the children. We see that even in young relationship, and this obviously, the difference between men and women is always higher when the children arrives. Some public wage system in Switzerland value actually unpaid care work in the household as a work experience. How much the care work is count towards work experience depend on the specific wage system in place in the different regions. We have one good example, which is, so this is not something that is per law or at all federal level, but we have one good example is the city of Lausanne that actually takes into account 66% of the years dedicated to unpaid care work, for example, raising children, and consider it as a meaningful experience in the calculation then of the initial salary. So that is something where actually companies or public institutions can take into account the unpaid care work and value that as an experience. Because in Switzerland, women usually tend to work part-time, and then will also sometimes even stop going into paid work while raising small children. So this is something, well, a tool or a mechanism that could be used to compensate that. Then in general also, and that is a legislative initiative, and that is actually on the whole federal level. Taking care of relatives is also recognized in Switzerland by the law. And here we have quite a special measure where actually, well, the people taking care of others don't receive a salary per se, but there is a credit and like a bonus for education or assistance task, which will be included in the pension system. This means that the people, and mostly women, of course, that decide either to reduce the time of work and work part-time, or either stop completely to work in a paid on the labor market a couple of years, or to educate their children, or have to take care of, for example, their parents or elderly people, or people close to the family. They actually can register that to the pension system and then receive bonuses when they're going into the pension. This mechanism enabled to actually monetize a little bit and recognize the work, the unpaid care work women do.
Дякую, пані Микола. Насправді цікавий досвід.
Thank you, Michaela. Very stimulating experience, like this credit points or bonuses. Very interesting. So maybe this is something that we can take into account while compensating for unpaid care and household work carried out by family members. I believe that it's a very good idea. I also want to pass it over to Jessica. And then I also want to open it up to our national experts and participants. Think about your questions while Jessica is speaking. Maybe there are some specific issues or points that we haven't discussed so far. We still have a little bit of time left. So take advantage of this remaining time to discuss as many issues as possible, because that will definitely facilitate the strategy development. Jessica, over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I think I would echo the points that have gone before me and say that we certainly haven't cracked this one yet either. I think it's definitely a cultural norm that we're all trying to shift rather than necessarily it being limited within borders. One of the things that we have tried to do is try to assist women who want to come into work. So we've had specific government schemes on returners and trying to help those people who have taken kind of an extended long time out of the workplace due to care work, who often find it difficult to return back. We're also currently looking at legislation around carers leave, which would be unpaid leave, but kind of getting that specific recognition of the role of caring within legislation. And I think also we've tried to normalize a fairer distribution of that caring role. So we've got specific rights around shared parental leave and pay, and also trying to normalise the role of flexible and hybrid working, which previously has kind of often been touted as a way to ensure that women can return to the workplace, but I think we also want to express that it's actually just a norm in the way of working, so that we can potentially see more men taking this up. I think part of what we've tried to do is look to try and encourage men to take a more active role, but then also role model that. We've got organisations, certainly there are significant numbers of employers who go above and beyond the statutory requirements and have provide equal parental leave and pay, regardless of which parent they employ. But I think it will take time for us to break down those barriers in terms of ensuring that men are not only taking on a shared caring role, but also ensuring that we are valuing that caring role in the same way that we value economic participation.
Дякую, пані Джесіко.
Thank you, Jessica. Dear participants, are there any questions? I have one question, but I will open it up for you first if you have any questions. I don't see any raised hands. Well, if there are no questions from the participants, I will use my privilege of the moderator. I have the following question. If my memory serves me right, the International Labour Organization published a global report every other year. And one of the reports was dedicated to the gender pay gap. I think it was called like that, what is behind the gender pay gap. The authors estimated gender pay gap in different countries, and they tried to understand the correlation between gender pay gap with the median or average salary. And they made the following assumption. The level of wages, which is like 53% from the median or average salary, is the optimal indicator for reducing gender pay gap. So they made this assumption. It was also supported by some economic explanations. Hence my question, could you share the experience in your countries? So what is the ratio between the minimum wages and the median or average salary? Ukraine is in dire straits right now. So the issue of raising minimum wages is not really on the agenda right now, because we are going through some trials and tribulations right now. But sooner or later, we will obtain a victory within this war. And we will have to regulate the issue of wages and salaries, and we will have to factor in the gender component. So we would like to ground our decisions in the international experience. So could you please share any expertise or any knowledge that you have on this topic in your countries?
I can step in to a certain extent. We have a national living wage, so the government does set a minimum level. We don't necessarily, it's set by a specific commission, which is independent. Every time that there are increases in the national living wage, it overwhelmingly benefits women because they are more likely to be on the lowest pay. We don't necessarily have a mechanism for how we I think they set that based on a recognition of pay more generally and inflation, and considering household bills, etc., rather than necessarily having a gendered aspect, because obviously it's a wage floor rather than necessarily using it as a tool for gender equality, because it's not necessarily going to impact the median or impact women moving further up. But obviously it does have a beneficial outcome for our reducing the gender pay gap, but obviously it also at the same time puts men's wages up as well. So we don't necessarily work it out on that kind of ratio as deemed by the ILO.
Розумію, дякую, Джесіко.
Point taken. Thank you, Jessica. What about you, Simon? Or what about you, Michaela? What about Switzerland? Have you heard of this ratio, like this, the ratio of the minimum wage and the median or average salary?
So yes, we use in most of the descriptive statistics, we use the median. We do this when we just purely look at wages and compare these. But when we do a deconstruction of the wage, so when we compute the unexplained wage gap, we have to look at the average wages because it's a statistical because of statistical reasons. It is not possible. I'm not sure if it's not possible or just way more difficult to compute the unexplained gender earnings gap between with a median. I'm leaning out of the window and I would say that it's not easy, not feasible with our current methodology. So that's why unexplained gender wage gaps, we usually look at averages, but when we look at other measures, we usually look at the median. When we look at the median, we see that women tend to be highly represented in low earnings in wages in the bottom half or even the bottom quarter of the wage distribution, and men are usually highly represented in the top earners, which usually also has to do with the professional position someone has. Regarding the minimum wage, I think that there is no mandatory minimum wage at the national level in Switzerland. We have some cantons, some regions which have local minimum wages, but regarding to that, we cannot really say how it's going.
Дякую.
Thank you. Karen, what about you? Any inputs from you?
I think I'll pass. I think I'll pass on that
But
issue.
I guess I know what your answer might be. What did you say?
I think I'm just going to pass on that for now. Thank you.
Дякую. Шановні учасники, підкажіть, чи
Thank you. Dear participants, are there any questions? So maybe something came to your mind while we were having this discussion, because we have this great opportunity to revert to some of the previous issues. If there's nothing, if you allow me, I would like to communicate our next steps within the strategy development to all of you. So what we intend to do next before we finalize the strategy. Our today's event is one of the milestones in the development of the strategy. We still have a number of strategic sessions ahead of us. And during these strategic sessions, we will continue consolidating and analyzing all the inputs that we have collected so far, including the inputs from our today's event. So the experience presented today will be analyzed. We will put it on paper. We will reflect it in the form of a document, and it will definitely be incorporated in the draft strategy that we will craft and then submit for endorsement. As regards our specific next steps, the next step is a strategic session during which we will identify strategic operational objectives for the strategy. And during this strategic session, we want to produce the first draft of the strategy. Later, this document will be approved. And in this regard, I would like to encourage all of you to actively participate in all the further stages of the strategy development. So do join our strategic sessions, do contribute to the document, and not so much the strategy itself, but the action plan. Because we were exposed to your experience, now we are familiar with your vision, with your advice. All this will serve as a robust foundation for the strategy and the action plan. We will also engage CSOs, academic institutions, and the strategy will be grounded in a very specific action plan. And when we translate this action plan into reality, we will be able to achieve equal pay and reduce gender pay gap. We have two deadlines, or like we do have two timeframes, 2022, 2025. This is the first implementation stage. And then 2025, 2030. This is the second implementation stage. We do understand that if we want to achieve longer term operational objectives, we will need more time. Like some of the speakers mentioned today, that we need to ensure the sustainability of the process if we want to be successful. And it will take several years because we need some time to track down trends, to understand how adopted policies have an impact on gender pay gap and equal pay. So we also decided to design a longer term strategy. It will comprise two stages, 2022, 2025, 2025, 2030. And we believe that by dint of that, we will be able to achieve the goals and objectives that we set for ourselves. As for the approval stages, under our national legislation, this document has to be prepared by the government of Ukraine. So the government of Ukraine will be the ultimate owner of the strategy. Therefore, this strategy has to go through the entire approval procedure. So this document will have to be approved by all the line ministries, entities and agencies within the government of Ukraine. This strategy will also have to be endorsed by territorial agencies and regional and local authorities, because the implementation will be taking place in close partnership and coordination with the local stakeholders. And we will need their technical and organizational support in order to achieve the full implementation of the strategy. So once the strategy is finalized, once the strategy is approved by all the relevant stakeholders, the Ministry of Economy will submit the strategy for consideration and approval by the Prime Minister of Ukraine. But before it happens on the highest level, we also want to engage you. We want to encourage your participation. We want you to see that the work that we are doing today is encapsulated in the document itself. And I also assume that in this process, we will definitely have some additional questions. So we really hope for your continued support for the development of this strategy. And we really hope that you will continue contributing with your inputs. I guess that at this point, we can try and summarize our event today and then call it a day. I want to express my sincere gratitude to our speakers and experts. Thank you very much for having found the time and opportunity to join. We are very delighted. It's a pity that we don't really have as many participants as we hoped, because there was an air raid alert for about 1.5 hours. Well, I really hope that nothing bad happened during this air raid alert, but it's very troubling and unsettling to continue operating under such conditions. So I'm very grateful to have our state online. And I also want to say a separate thank you to Mr. Rakesh Patri, as a representative of the Equal Pay International Coalition. Thank you very much for your participation in this event. Thank you very much for your contribution. And we would like to provide you with assurances that our today's event is a solid foundation for our continued cooperation and partnership. By the way, when I was reflecting on your opening statements, I wanted to wish something really neat and nice to you. And you started your working day extremely early because you had to join this meeting at 8 o'clock in the morning. So I really hope that each and every day of yours will get off to a good start, that your days will start with smiles and with good news from Ukraine. You know that every day you wake up, you read about the current developments in Ukraine, and you see some good news there, and we will do our utmost to provide for that. I want to wish Mr. Patry and all the speakers all the best. It's been a great pleasure to have this cooperation with you, and we will definitely keep you posted on our next steps and achievements. If you as experts can provide us with some supporting materials, we will be more than grateful. Maybe you have something on paper, maybe there's some additional literature or references that we can use, Rakesh. If it's fine with you, I mean, since we started with your opening statement, I would like to finish it off with your closing remarks. Over to you, please.
Well, thank you very much, Andrea, and thank you for those kind remarks. And let me just say that starting at 8 o'clock in the morning is definitely not a hardship compared to everything that you are going through in Ukraine, most obviously. Thank you for organizing this to the ILO office and to colleagues in the Ukrainian government and all of the participants. And thank you particularly to our colleagues, to Ms. Jensen, as well as colleagues from Switzerland and the UK for participating in this. Their expert advice was, I think, incredibly valuable and useful, certainly for me and hopefully for everyone else that was participating. So once again, huge thanks to the Ukrainian government, to the ILO, and all speakers and participants for taking part in this event. I hope this is only the first of many that we'll be able to continue doing. Thank you again.
Дякую.
Thank you. A big thank you, everyone. Thank you for your support. I wish a good day to everyone who has just started their working day, or enjoy your evening if your day is over. So let's stay in touch and stay tuned. We are always delighted to welcome you at our events. And believe me that our today's event is like this silver lining. So thank you very much, and hope to see you soon, and hope for our future work and cooperation.
До зустрічі.